see that there's 17 people in this room that voted on that poll, which really gives me this indication that you're finding it tough. It's 5:30. You're ready to go to the party. You want a free beer. You want to go play your Xbox in your hotel room. Has anyone actually done that? Did anyone take their Xbox out and play it last night in the hotel room? No, okay, I figured there'd be at least one. So 17, I want that number up or I'm not going to start. While you're voting for that, and you can do it via SMS or you can go to the website on your mobile if you're too cheap to send a 5-cent SMS. Out of interest, how many of you guys in a room have actually done any AngularJS development? Because I want to just set some expectation. Okay. And others in the room, any JavaScript development whatsoever? Right, okay. So for the AngularJS guys in the room, the expectation of this talk was that I did want to introduce like kind of the fundamentals of Angular from that perspective, and that's going to take about 25 minutes to get through that and why Angular. And then we're going to go very deep into an example app that we've been building in the team that actually shows how you can leverage AngularJS within inside SharePoint. So for the Angular guys in the room, I'd love feedback off this session if there's anything you think that I missed in terms of your experience with AngularJS. My background, in actual fact, is I've been a web developer, mainly on the managed code side for the last 10 years, and begrudgingly held back from jumping into the client-side world of web development up until about a year ago. And this talk I did at the SharePoint conference as well, and it's just kind of keep continually improving it. So I'd love any feedback on this session as we get started. So what's been favorite sessions so far? Anyone shout out what's their best, other than the keynotes, which were epically long and lots of new features, what's been one of your favorites? Anybody? Xamarin, yeah, that's pretty amazing stuff. Anybody else? TypeScript, yeah, well that guy's just a legend. Anybody else? So TypeScript and Xamarin. No one's mentioned Scott Hanselman. In the last session I was like, Scott. Yeah, right. This is kind of de facto that he's always going to be one of the best presentations. And anyone overseas? Anyone not from America here? Wow, that's cool. Countries, yell out. Where are you from? Denmark. Belgium. Brazil. Wow, you're from all over the place. Sweden. Russia. Anyone from Australia, New Zealand? No one's gone that crazy way. I lived over there for 8 years. It was a long way to come to these US conferences and then have to fly back and not be jet lagged. So count yourselves lucky with the Eastern Europeans with only the 7-8 hour flights. Who's, well, we can see from the poll, okay, 40 now. Okay, I'm a little bit happier. Thank you for contributing. I expect that much engagement throughout the session. Let's just click that up while we're waiting to start, and I'll just show you. So this is, if anyone was in Rob Howard's session or Brian Jones's session, this is actually an app for PowerPoint. So when you go to the store and you add an app, you can actually click on this app, and it's called Poll Everywhere. You can add the questions, and it automatically does all this stuff in the background. So they've built this as a provider-hosted app, so their service is running in Windows Azure, and then this is just surfaced within PowerPoint. So I actually quickly put this together before the session. So we've got a fair big spread there. So I can see that the majority of you guys are still running on SharePoint solutions. So out of those guys that put their hands up for SharePoint solutions, how many of those are on 2013? Okay, so there's a fair few of you still building sandbox or full trust solutions on top of 2013 and not the app model. What else can I see from that data? And there's some net new developers. So in no SharePoint development at all, there's 12 guys. And then there's one, who put other? What's the other? Yeah, okay. And then the other 40 people in the room, if you bring your Xboxes up to the front, I will destroy those for you for not contributing in the poll. Okay, so we will get started. It says, Okay, so we are going to be talking about SharePoint 2013 apps today with the Angular framework. So my name is Jeremy Thake. I've just actually joined Microsoft on Monday. So I literally did new employee orientation on Monday, flew to San Francisco on day 2 of Microsoft to be at this conference. I spent the most of my beginning years at university computer science in London, but I moved to Australia straight after graduating, and essentially was a web developer there, doing a lot of ASP.NET, doing a lot of managed code for about 8 years, and got kind of really dug in and deep on the SharePoint side of the house. Then I relocated to New York 3 years ago now, and worked for a very large vendor called AvePoint, and was an architect there building kind of SharePoint apps. And then, as I say, as of Sunday, I moved to Seattle to relocate to work in Redmond for Microsoft as a senior product marketing manager there. And my role there is to focus primarily on the pro developer audience. So essentially, if you're in Visual Studio and you're writing for Office, SharePoint, Office 365, that's the market that I own, and we'll be helping you guys to make sure that you've got all the latest tools and different things. So I'll be working with a lot of you guys in a room if you are touching those products. I learned a lot from building as an architect back in Australia, and also as an ISV on building solutions on top of that stack. And there is an app that's in the store called AvePoint Meetings, which I was the product manager and architect for. So I've brought a lot of the kind of experience way back from when it was in the beta days, or beta, depending on where you're from, to the knowledge of the team, and hopefully you'll see that as I present today. I do blog a fair amount on jeremythake.com, and I tweet quite a bit on @jthake, and there are my contact details. So if you have questions after this session because you're racing off to the party, I will not be offended. You can please just feel free to ping me after the fact. So, as I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to kind of explain from my perspective why I think AngularJS is important, and do a bit of an introduction to AngularJS, because my gut feel was that with this room there'd be a bit of a spread of SharePoint developers, web developers, and some AngularJS developers in the room. So I do apologize to the AngularJS guys in the room, but I just want to kind of give a bit of a primer, because there was only ever one other session here on AngularJS. And then I'm going to just explain some of the things that are a little bit different that you have to do with a SharePoint app or an Office app when you use Angular, compared to if you just jumped in and started building Angular web applications. And then I'll actually demonstrate an app that I've been building with a bunch of other people, which is going to be available on GitHub soon. And some tips and tricks that I've come across as I've learned using SharePoint with AngularJS, and just AngularJS in general moving into this space. So from a perspective of Angular, I think for me, now in Microsoft and previous, really, it's great to be able to be a Microsoft conference and be able to put up something like that on the screen without being shot from the back of the room. The world's changing, and Microsoft are making really huge efforts to make sure that we can cater for all the different types of developers that are out there to build for Office 365 and the various products that sit underneath that whole banner. And AngularJS has been around for a significant while now, and as I say, it's been open sourced since January 2010 by Google. And the really nice thing is, and some of these slides are from the NG conference that Google ran specifically for AngularJS, was that there have been over 600 contributors on that open source project, with about 2,500 product requirements that have been added as part of that project. But I think for me, a lot of the questions I get is why AngularJS over some of the other frameworks out there, is that there are 14 core developers from Google that actually work on that framework. So a little bit like all the announcements this week that Microsoft have made around the WinJS and some of the other things that have been open sourced, where Microsoft, we now, have team members that are dedicated to those open source projects. Google have the same thing with the AngularJS framework. Plus they have the community like any other open source project. Now, there is a significant amount of training out there already. When I was first ramping up, I actually used a lot of Pluralsight training. I quite like the idea of being able to take it offline and use it on my different mobile devices. And I find the way to consume on Pluralsight works for me. But there are different approaches there as well. And also, there's a significant amount of books. So this isn't something that's going to fleet for a little while and then disappear. AngularJS is really, really here to stay. And one last thing that I think you'll see is that there were other frameworks out there like GWT and Ember.js and Backbone and Knockout. And I think that there's similarities between those frameworks, but AngularJS is a little bit different. It adds a little bit more extra than some of those other frameworks. Now, I'm not going to get into a religious war. You could absolutely say, I'm going to use Knockout and stick with Knockout. But for me personally, I'm seeing Angular as a very obvious way for me to write with my experience as an object-oriented kind of web developer on a managed code side living in ASP.NET. The transition for me to write in AngularJS has been a lot easier for me than when I started to look at some of the other frameworks. And this is just an example of Google search results, actually, to show how that interest over time. And you can see there that the AngularJS has significantly spiked since its launch and is actually growing at a rapid rate in terms of adoption in web applications. Now, the way to think about AngularJS in a very simple way is to compare it to like an Excel. So if you think of an Excel spreadsheet application, when I'm plugging in values into my cells and then in another cell I sum them up, I don't have to write the plumbing that says, go and whenever that number 4 changes in A2, I'm going to go and update the sum value that's in C2. This all done for me. So essentially, we have the data that's stored away. We have this view kind of layer that's displaying all that information. And when that data changes, the view is going to be watching for those changes and update based on its dependencies. Now, another aspect of it from a Google perspective is that they actually built this thing called Google Feedback. And the original build was over 17,000 lines of code. And to commit to AngularJS, what they actually decided to do was to rewrite it because they were finding that operationally and maintenance-wise it was a real trouble. So that original project was built in 6 months by 3 devs. And they actually rewrote it in Angular in a period of 3 weeks. So obviously there was a lot of product design decisions that were already made in the first approach to building it. But it got it down to 1,500 lines of code. Which is a significantly cleaner piece of code to maintain and operate. And obviously, a lot of the feedback that they did on that was improving Angular framework. So a lot of the product requirements and the contributions from Angular came from building that Google Feedback. And they're actually starting to replace some of their other web applications with AngularJS as well. So if Google are invested in this framework, it's open sourced. If you guys invest in learning in this framework, there's going to be very little risk of this going away anytime soon. What I like about this from a perspective of being an MVC developer in ASP.NET world is that it handles a lot of that DOM and the AJAX glue that if you were doing jQuery and you were kind of having to find the element on the page and refresh it, and you'd have to kind of put that in line with your business logic to update your pages, AngularJS kind of cleans all that up a bit because you don't have to focus on when my data changes on my web page that I have to remember to go and update it everywhere else where that is relevant on the screen. So Angular kind of takes away a lot of that aspect, and that's really that MVC or MVVM type approach. The other benefit that I find it gives me when I'm building applications in AngularJS, especially with SharePoint apps, is that you get a very defined structure. So I can start to break up my controllers and my services and a lot of my other script logic into separate files so that if a new developer comes on board, they can actually kind of get a grasp of what this app's doing very, very quickly. In the past, when I've worked on JavaScript projects, you have like mountains of thousands of lines of code in one JavaScript file, and it doesn't really encourage you to break those things up in a nice way. Now, AngularJS is really augmenting JavaScript. So you could do it properly with JavaScript without Angular. But what I'm finding is that Angular kind of encourages you to do the right thing up front with having those controllers and those views and those services, which we'll cover today. One of the questions I do get here is, well, is it in isolation? If I pick AngularJS, am I not allowed to use TypeScript or any of the other frameworks? Well, in actual fact, there's some projects out there, and the demonstration I'm doing today, we're open sourcing at the moment, an iteration of it where we're going to include TypeScript as part of it. So you can include things like TypeScript and AngularJS together. It doesn't mean once you've picked that framework that you're limiting yourself for some of the things that are going on. They do different things for you in your applications. But today, we're really focusing on AngularJS in this session. I find the other aspect of the whole model view controller is that it does handle the CRUD, so the create, the read, the update, delete. Now, yes, for the SharePoint guys in the room, if you have a SharePoint list and you add some columns to that list, technically you have a SharePoint add new to get a list item and it builds your form automatically. With AngularJS, we can still do the add new, and you'll see in my demos later on how we can do that, but you have full control of that form, the look and feel. And there's a lot of controls you get for free directly out of the box with AngularJS to make it very quick to build applications, and even if it's just prototypes to start with, whereas if you're kind of building something with just plain JavaScript, you'd have to kind of be really hunting around and grabbing lots of different frameworks to get your application to work. So Angular is quite a broad framework from the perspective of the UI controls as well. And also, and unfortunately, with only having an hour to cover, it is testable. I will show you very quickly some of the things that you can do to make this a testable framework, but AngularJS actually has built-in testability into it, which is going to be very, very useful for developers that come from that managed code world where they want that little bit more control over how they test things in an automated way. So, from a very kind of high-level Angular overview, and again, Pluralsight does this in about a 12-hour course, so don't expect to know Angular completely by the end of this session, but just wanted to give you the primers. Essentially, to start with AngularJS, you're going to have a directive at the top in your HTML element that notifies your HTML page that this is where you want your Angular app to run. And then in the script element, you're then going to load the AngularJS script. So what that's going to do is once that runs and executes that script, the script's going to go find that directive ng-app, and then it knows that within that element is where your Angular app is. Now, inside this concept of this model view controller, or MVVM, Google at their conference decided that they didn't want to kind of tag themselves with those things. So they actually came up with we're MVW, which means model view whatever. So a lot of people have been like, well, is it MVVM, is it MVC? Google's straight answer is it's MVW. So essentially what that means is that if the model changes where the data is, or if the template changes, in the old school way of JavaScript, you had to push that up to the screen. In the AngularJS approach, because of the way that it watches the model and it watches the view, or the template, sorry, if there's any changes to that from the page down into the model, or if the model is changing from another reason back up to the view, those things happen instantly. So it's a lot less code on the plumbing, as I've mentioned before. And so when we write to the screen, this is a very basic example, but I can just use those double parentheses, and I can start grabbing objects, much like I would do if I was doing ASP.NET MVC. I don't have to kind of do a span or a div and give it an ID, and then in my JavaScript then find that span or div and set it. I can just simply use those elements directly in my HTML. And Angular handles that for me when it's passing the web browser. So I find that this makes for very clean code when you're building your apps, and you'll see this as you move forward. The other thing I think is nice is when you kind of instantiate the app in the background in the JavaScript, it is very clean. You can call it what you like. Most of the examples you see on the web are either my app or app. I kind of stuck with my app throughout here. And you'll see that gets a little bit more complicated as you dependency inject new modules. But essentially, once you've got that my app line in your JavaScript, you can then introduce controllers. So if you have your controller in HTML on your page, in your JavaScript file, you define your controller just simply like this. So the phone list control is available as an element, and you'll see in a minute in the HTML. And in my function, I just display that in the JavaScript and pass through the scope. So in this scope, I'm actually creating a new thing called phones, and I'm adding some JSON there for 2 different phones that I want added into that market, into that phones area. And then in my controller, all I'm doing here is I'm adding a directive called ng-controller and using that name. So one thing to bear in mind, and this did burn me a few hours, was that if you don't keep the function name of phone list control exactly the same as the name in that in the value of that attribute there for the ng-controller, it's not going to hook it up. So just double check those things. If you're not seeing any activity on your web page, it's probably because you haven't hooked those things up correctly. There is one exception to this in a moment, which I'll cover. And then, so you can see here that we've set the name and the snippet in my JSON. So to write that out, all I'm using is another directive inside my LI, which is an ng-repeat directive that says for every phone in that phones collection that I set in that JavaScript, I'm going to write those things out to the screen. And again, we're not using find the element on the page and set the value. We're just simply using those double parentheses to render that to the screen. So very, very clean code to get things up in a web browser. So what I wanted to show you to start with is I actually found when I was learning Angular that it was very useful to use something called JS Fiddle. How many of you guys in a room have used JS Fiddle or some of the others like Plunker and different things? It's great for sharing samples. These samples are available. I have shared them on my account. Essentially what this allows me to do is start to play live in real time in a web browser with HTML code, the equivalent JavaScript, and then to actually see the rendered values. So you can see here that we've got the ng-app in that in the top there on my element, and we've loaded the ng controller into the body, and again we've got the ng repeat that goes for every phone in phones, render that to the screen. In my JavaScript, you see that's exactly what was in that slide. That's my JavaScript for actually putting those values in. And then on the right-hand side, this is the output that you'll see from the app. Very, very simple. But if I actually went in here and said, well, why have we got, because these were Google demos, we should be having something like the Nokia 1020 in here because it's a far superior phone. And what you'll see here when you click run is that immediately it's going to go and update that runtime. Now, the reason I like JS Fiddle, and a lot of you put your hands up, this didn't happen the last time I presented this, was if I'm having trouble with my script, I can actually send this JS Fiddle to a friend on Skype or Link or what have you. They can look at it, and they might find a mistake in my code. They can change it and send me back the changes. Now, it doesn't mean I have to send projects to them in zip files. It's a very quick, interactive way of getting things suggested. And I've found in forums as well, the MSDM forums and Stack Overflow, a lot of people are using this as a way of troubleshooting very simple things. Now, obviously, if you introduce SharePoint to this piece, it does get a little more complicated because you've got that authentication step you would have to do if you had some REST calls or what have you in there. But for very basic Angular stuff, this is extremely useful. Now, the other thing to introduce is that as well as the out-of-the-box ones, directives like ng-app and like ng-repeat, you can actually build your own directives as well. So in this example here, I'll show you, the very key part here is that we can create our own directives. So in this case, I want to be able to show up a list of data, but I want to be able to double-click on that value in the screen and edit it in place, and then click Save, and it will disappear. So all I have to do that is add that element to my HTML, and this is the tricky bit, is that unlike the controllers where the name of the value is exactly the same as the function in JavaScript, you'll see that it's edit-in-place. When you name the directive, you basically do it kind of like that, the camel casing, where you remove the dashes and you capitalize the words. Wasn't that clear to me in the documentation? So I'm just kind of saving you a few hours of looking at it and going, why didn't that work? That's just one thing I caught as I was running these directives. So with the directives demo, essentially if I look in here, you'll see that I'm using an ng-repeat on contact in contacts. And in there, I've got the edit-in-place, and then I'm writing out to the screen that contact.name. I'm passing that through. And then below here, I'm actually defining a directive, which I won't go into in too much detail, but it allows me to render that to the screen with this kind of double-click event. So on the right-hand side, you'll see that they're listed, and you'll notice that as I go over here, I'm getting the handle. And if I double-click here, I can come in here and adjust that. Now, what you would have noticed is as I typed in my name there to replace it, it automatically updated the exact same instance of me on the bottom. The reason it does that is that essentially, if I scroll down on the HTML here, I have the same repeater again there, but I'm just using double parentheses and contact name. Angular knows that if that model of contact changes, it needs to go and change that AngularJS repeat pattern and refresh it on the fly. Imagine if you had to code that for every key press if you were writing that without this Angular framework. So this experience is something that end users now expect when they're dealing with web applications. So Angular really makes that a lot quicker. The other aspect of Angular, which I want to introduce just for the purposes of jumping into the SharePoint app, is this thing of services. This really is a way of me kind of moving a lot of my business logic out of my views and just calling it within my controllers. So it really gives me that separation of concerns, and that will come out a bit clearer later on. So I can do all sorts of different things here where I can define a service and essentially have it return values or do some calculations. I can pass things in there as well. And then when I call that service from within my control, I can return that into my scope, my collection called hellos, and render that to the screen. So if I just show you that JS fiddle here. So we're nice and easy here, but what you'll notice here is that I don't have any of the ng-app and etc. in that HTML. That's all been handled for me in Fiddler because I've actually said that this is an Angular app. So Fiddle has some default ways of handling Angular to keep your code even cleaner in the HTML. In the JavaScript body here, you can see that I've defined that service, and then I'm calling it at the bottom, if I scroll down, directly in that controller that I've used. Now, in this example, I've also used a factory and I've used a provider. Now again, in essence of time, I can't go through those in too much detail, but I just wanted to highlight that there are some cases where you may not want to use a service and you might want to use a provider, which is very similar to a service, but it allows you to do things like configure when you instantiate the provider or the factory up front. And so that's very more a similar concept to what you'd have if you were writing C# files. A lot of the samples that you'll see will only ever use the services, but just be aware of those things. As you get building out a bigger Angular app, you're really going to need to investigate into all of those different areas. And then lastly, the demo that they use on the Angular homepage essentially allows me to have a to-do app. And there's a lot of JavaScript frameworks that use this. So I'm going to just put in here, pick up my Xbox One, because I'm sure one of you will give me it. And that's just added that directly there. I can come in here and click close, and you'll see that it's underscored it straight away. Now, in this, essentially, jumping through again, we have this aspect of that to-do control at the top. We're setting the to-dos collection scope where we're defining with JSON the default values when I boot my app up of what exactly is going to be created in there. And then we have this add to-do event that can be called from a click within the HTML. And you'll see there that we're using this to-do.push, which will essentially add whatever is in my to-do.text, which is the text box on the screen, into that collection. So one other aspect you might not have noticed, which again is around the binding, as I add new ones, is go to the party. You'll notice that I also get this 2 of 4 remaining, and you'll notice that automatically updated. In my code, if I just scroll here, you'll see the scope.remaining equals function. Essentially, because I'm looping through that for each there, I'm looping through that to-dos collection. Anytime that to-dos collection changes, Angular knows to rerun that remaining function and update the view where it says 2 of 4 or 3 of 5, etc. remaining. So you don't have to, every time I wouldn't have to in the add to do event, when I click my add button, I don't have to call a function that says update the remaining values. It's all handled as part of the plumbing of the binding of AngularJS. So it does make for very, very clean code in that approach. And on the Angular site, they actually show, if you didn't use Angular, what the JavaScript would be, and it's a significantly longer file. And again, if you ask one JavaScript developer to write that compared to another one, you're going to get very inconsistent results. By using the Angular framework, you get a consistent approach to how those views are being updated in JavaScript. And this is something that if you were using ASP.NET MVC, you'll be used to, or WPF or XAML. So this is now giving you the ability to do this within a web browser just using JavaScript. Now, I won't go through these demos in these last two JS fiddles in too much detail, but just to kind of highlight some of the other powerful things, I can do things like this, where I can put in here and broadcast, and what this was doing is when I click broadcast, those other text boxes are watching for those events to happen and pushing those things through. And now what that means is you can start doing really cool things with animation within AngularJS, and there's quite a few games out there already that are built completely on JavaScript. So don't see AngularJS purely as just this MVW type thing of binding to the view, to the model, to the templates there. Think about it as there's a lot of additional bits to the Angular framework that make this extremely powerful to use as a pure web application development platform. So, and the links for those quick demos were there. So with SharePoint, essentially what we found with this was there are a few things you have to change. So rather than putting the ng-app directive in the HTML element of your SharePoint app, especially if you're SharePoint hosted, what you do is you need to reference your JavaScript within there. But what you also have to do is you need a div where you actually tell Angular to watch for your app. And so if you're just using a new project within Visual Studio with a SharePoint hosted app, all you need to do is add that script into your SharePoint hosted app, and then you just put this div in here. And everything within that div is part of the AngularJS app. So the app that I wrote as part of me learning this framework and kind of open sourcing and getting more feedback was called Complete Me. And I think the easiest way to do this is to jump straight into a demonstration of that app. So I've got Visual Studio 2013 running here, and I'm just going to click Start on here and start the debugging and pray to the demo gods that my internet's going to be up and running and good to go. For those of you that are using a fair few different Office 365 tenants, I've found I use LastPass, and it allows me to very quickly and easily keep up to date with different usernames and passwords and jump into my logins there as you have different tenants. The Complete Me app here is very, very simple. It allows me to make sure I don't miss my flight. Add a task. I have a date picker here, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, where I can add those tasks onto my screen. I can double click, so that directive of the inline editing that I showed before, I can double click in here and I can change things. So for instance, I could change that task to my boss because he always misses his flights. I could change the date in here. I can mark that it's completed when it's done and click save. And that's automatically going back to the SharePoint list where that data is being stored and submitting that back. Some of the other nice things that Angular gives you for very few little lines of code is the searchability directly on the screen. So for instance, if I search for Xbox, as I'm typing, you'll immediately see it's filtering the information on my screen. I'll show you how little amount of code that took to do that refresh. And then on the left-hand side here, I have this bump me, which I just zoom in on here. You'll see that, how many times have you had a task where you look at your task list every day and you're just like, that can go tomorrow, give it till the end of the week, or maybe in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or just forget about it, just whatever. Just don't want to do it, don't want to handle it. So this functionality, I'll show you in a moment of how we can actually build that out. And as I click there, that's immediately going to update the screen. As you see, it's jumped my task down on the screen, and then it saved that back to SharePoint for me. So that's in its element. This is the Angular app that we've built. And what I'll do now is I'll walk through how I've pieced that together inside that Visual Studio project. So if I just hide the, let's just go stop actually, so we've got a bit bigger screen element here. You'll see on the right-hand side here in my Solution Explorer, very typical SharePoint app with having the content, the images, the pages, and the scripts areas. But what may not be familiar is that we've actually got some HTML files there, and you'll see that I've got a structure there of having these controllers and these services as part of my app. So it's allowed me to structure my application in a much cleaner way than you may have seen without something like the Angular framework. To get things set up, as I've mentioned before, you do need to reference the Angular framework in your scripts here. And as well as that, I have a few other frameworks that I'm using, which I'll mention near the end of the session. And then, as I said before, we just have this ng-app, my app here, which essentially allows me to target this and saying, this is where my app's going to be running in the whole purposes of my screen. Now, with that, you'll see that, well, you may recognize already that we have this remaining and todos.length in there. So a lot of those JS fiddles that I use to test my Angular work, I then immediately moved over into this project. It allowed me to kind of test things in isolation of SharePoint and then move that code over. And in terms of the, just to kind of highlight the ng-repeat there, you'll notice that I've got a pipe there which says order by due date. So when I went in and double-clicked and did an inline edit of that task and changed the date, or if I did clicked on the smiley face to bump that task, when it persisted that back to the model that Angular was watching, because the repeat had an enforced order, it immediately updated the view. It wasn't something I had to resort the tasks. It did it for me automatically. And then the other pipe where it had the filter, which is linked up to the search value, that search text box that was inside the demo was mapped to a model called search. And any time you typed into that search text box, it immediately meant that that ordering and that filtering had to change. So if I just expand this div row here, you'll see that I have, in that input text box, I've bound the value that's in that text box to the ng model of search. So anytime I changed that text box value, it immediately looked to see what was using it and refreshed the view on the page. So very small amount of code, but does a lot of functionality for your application. Now, from a controller's perspective, the main guts of the application was in that to-do controller. And one thing I wanted to bear in mind is a lot of the samples out there use a very simple way of defining your controller in this kind of layout. But what I learned very early on is if you go through and minify a lot of your JavaScript, you can't define it in that way with just the string element with the to-do control. You actually need to use this longer syntax here to define it so that when JavaScript minifies things and it renames stuff, that Angular still hooks up to the controller on the HTML page correctly. So please take that into account if you are using a tool to minify your JavaScript and maybe at the end package it all into one JavaScript file, that you take that into account when you're defining your controllers. And then the other aspect of the controller that you'll see is if you are using a directive, for instance, my edit in place directive that will allow me to double click. The unfortunate thing when you're using a directive is that when you want to load the template, you'll see here that I can link off to an HTML file, which is essentially my view HTML. With SharePoint, if you kind of pointed to your template in that approach, it doesn't actually work because you are in a relative URL, which is not where Angular thinks it is. So what you have to actually do, you could use this way. You could actually define your template view HTML directly in your JavaScript like this, but not everyone wants to write HTML like that and not have any IntelliSense, and it looks pretty ugly in a JavaScript file to be kind of building HTML in that way. It's like going back 10,000 years, maybe not 10,000 years. So what you can do instead of using the template is you can use the lower level compile of that directive. Now, all of this is available again in the slides, and I have this sample project available on my blog. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm using the JS request function to go and get my host web URL. And then inside here, I'm building the location of my view, which is in my HTML file. and then Angular knows to go and find it correctly for a SharePoint hosted app and for a provider hosted app as well. So that was one thing that, that if you really want to use Angular in a way where your template's separate in the HTML, you do need to do that. So let me just show you that right now. So in my view, where I'm actually rendering out my HTML, you'll see that, if I just minimize this, all that's in this file is essentially what's being used to render out each individual task. So for every to-do in my to-dos collection, it uses this view to render it to the screen. So the theory here is that if you had a web designer that wanted to just kind of touch the HTML and not be part of the JavaScript logic or any of the kind of the model, they can do this by just looking in the HTML file. And as I say, the way to kind of get that going in the code is you do need to have that compile rather than using the template URL, and I've just left that in the notes there. The other thing you have to do is, with a directive, you'll have actions that happen. Now, typically, when you have actions that happen, you would actually define them in a link here. Unfortunately, because you've used the compile construct here, you can't use the link. So to get the links to work, and it'll make more sense when I open this up. So for instance, when I'm doing the save command here, if I click save within that directive, which is the edit in place, when I click save, that's going to call off to my service to save that task to SharePoint. This, typically when you see the examples of the directives, would actually be in a link outside of this compile command here. But unfortunately, because you've used the compile, none of the other constructs within that directive work, because the compile is a lower level part of Angular. So that's one thing that is a little bit different when you're using SharePoint hosted apps with the AngularJS framework, is that you have to take this approach to link over to where your view HTML is. That's probably, other than the div with the ng-app lives, that's about the only two differences that you'll find when you're getting started with an AngularJS app. Now, the other aspect of the services, if I go straight back in actually, is that you'll notice that when I was calling the save here, so my save command there, I'm calling this SharePoint JSON service, and I'm clicking save task, and I'm passing through that task list name that I entered when I wanted to create that new task. I could have additional parameters there to pass through various different things as well, but for simplicity there, I'm only passing through that one thing. Now, you'll notice this construct of when, done, and fail, which is very similar to if you were using more standard JavaScript approaches. And it's essentially is when the service is done, that's what gets returned, and how you handle if that service throws an error. So if I jump to my services here in my JavaScript, so I have this SharePoint services, you'll see we have all of my logic that's tied to SharePoint in one JavaScript file, whether it's getting the current user, whether it's getting the tasks via REST, whether it's checking the task list exists, or saving that task off. I've moved all of that logic, all of that kind of plumbing into its own separate JavaScript file, and I'm calling that from the controller where the to-dos get rendered. So just to show you, if I jumped into, say, for instance, the REST service method function there, what you'll see is I'm getting the host web and the app web URLs. I'm building out my REST query URL. Now, for my app, I actually stored the task list in the parent site of the app. I could have crept the task list directly inside the app itself, in the app web. The reason I wanted it outside of the app, inside the parent area, was because that way the users can go directly to that task list and see it if they like. They can choose to change the views or create new views as they choose. So the app is like an additional way of getting to that task list and adding the value with the bump me and the inline editing, and obviously you could build even more functionality into that app. So this app could be deployed to a site that already had a task list, and it would find it and render all those tasks within my app. So then if you remove the app, all your task data still exists. If my task list was inside the app web when I installed the app and I removed the app, that task list would actually get removed. So you have to make decisions on where you want to store your data when you're building these SharePoint apps like that. Now, because of that, I actually have to use the SP request executor, because I'm not calling the task list within the app web itself. I'm calling out to the parent web. So it's on a different URL to what my app URL will be, my task list. And there's been other sessions that have covered this in a bit more detail. But what I will say is that when you're returning those REST queries here, you'll see that if the request query worked properly, I would use a deferred .resolve and pass that JSON back. Excuse me. If it failed for whatever reason, I would actually return the JSON error that came back up to my controller, and then my controller would get that message and handle it as it chose. So I'm handling it in the service, but I'm also deciding to handle it in the controller as well. And again, in presence of time, you'll see that, just quickly here, that what I'm also doing is in this instance, I'm using CSOM to build up how I create the list, the task list item when I'm newing up a task and calling that. So in Angular, I could use REST. I could use CSOM as well. I don't have to be kind of dependent just on REST. My experience, though, is that the rule that I'm seeing that most developers are doing, and something that I do as a habit, is if you're getting data from SharePoint, the REST API is a bit easier, it's a bit cleaner, it's faster. If you're doing a lot of manipulation of the data, I'm finding that CSOM is a little bit easier to code on that aspect. I do have a blog post, which I wrote a few weeks ago, actually, which compares when you should use CSOM to when you should use REST, and I'd highly recommend you check that out. But again, there's no right or wrong way of doing it. Both the APIs exist. They're both based on the same underlying code. They're just generated as different endpoints. It's just for SharePoint developers that have come from the SharePoint world, they might find it easier to write against CSOM. Whereas if you've come from a web developer world of using REST, you might find REST easier to build against. Now, the other aspect of services, and you may have noticed this, is that I actually have an additional service there, which is the mock SharePoint service. So the scenario here is that I don't want to call off to SharePoint. I just want to return some dummy data and not depend on SharePoint. So I have in this service the exact same function names I did in my real service, but what I'm doing is I've just created some dummy JSON that it returns. The reason you might want to do this is for your web developer who's testing particular scenarios, rather than having to go into SharePoint and create 100 tasks with different values and different due dates, you may want to just kind of hard code them inside these mock tests and allow the web developer then to use that mock to test his UI works properly, and then maybe to switch to another mock and test that other UI works properly. The way you switch between using the correct service and the mock service is essentially when you load these JavaScript files, if I just show you here, Angular will actually look at the order. So when it calls the mock SharePoint service.js, it will load that service, the mock one, which has got exactly the same service name. But because you've then called SharePoint service.js, it will replace that service with the real one. So if I wanted to use the mock one, I could either just remove the reference to SharePoint service, or I could put the mock script reference below the other one. So it allows me to choose which one gets used. I actually saw a company that were doing this in a slightly different way. They had another web application project. Well, it wasn't a SharePoint project, and they linked to all the files inside this Visual Studio project, and then they gave that one for the web developers to work on. So they didn't even need SharePoint to use this because it was abstracted from the SharePoint pages. It allowed it to build the AngularJS without needing to do that. And in future, we're actually going to do a series of blog posts that explain how to do that kind of developer versus designer approach where you don't even have that dependency of SharePoint or even Visual Studio if you choose not to. So that dependency ingestion aspect is it's very useful for eliminating the need to call SharePoint live and having that data there and just bootloading it inside a mock service. So a few quick tips and tricks. One thing that I realized early on was, Angular doesn't come with a date picker per se, But if you use this thing called UI Bootstrap, it's just another JavaScript file you add and reference. There is a CDN for it. That's what gave me that date picker in the screen. It also allows you to do things with grid layouts, where if you look there, I can actually do it assumes 12 columns across in each row. And all you do is you put classes on your HTML elements. So that app, if I loaded it on a Surface or if I loaded it on a mobile phone, would actually responsively move around. I'm not a CSS guy. This just does it. It works it all out for you. So Bootstrap UI gave me the grid layout thing in a very easy way. It also allowed me to do things like add new Angular directives for forms. So I could just put an ng-required attribute on my element, like my text box or my people picker, and it would immediately flag on the screen and highlight it red that you hadn't put a value in it, rather than me having to, on a submit event, go and check those things before I go through and process and reject it. So there's a lot of form stuff that you get for free there. And as I mentioned, the date picker too. Now, I'm just going to skip those tips. So the people picker control. So Rob Howard's session, which was 2 sessions before this, the SharePoint Power Hour, Rob Howard demoed a people picker that worked with a provider-hosted app. There is a people picker that works with a SharePoint-hosted app as well, which is available on MSDN. The problem with that people picker in the MSDN article right now is that it only really works for if you only have one people picker on the screen. So obviously with my edit in line, I actually had multiple different people pickers on the screen for the assigned to for every task that was listed. So I had to adapt that people picker a little bit. In my code sample, I show you how to do that. Essentially, you have to dynamically name the divs. So in this instance, the people picker element ID is kind of hard-coded in the MSDN sample. Every time I wrote to the model, the people picker div had a unique name that mapped to that model to allow me to find the correct people picker and wire it up. And then lastly, with the bump me, where I clicked on the smiley face to get the next Friday, next Saturday, next Tuesday, unfortunately, JavaScript doesn't have a very good out-of-the-box date add aspect, that something we're very familiar with in the .NET framework. So I was recommended to this moment.js framework, which allowed me to essentially take a normal JavaScript date and add the appropriate days or months or years so that it dynamically listed that out in my dropdown. So Moment was very useful there as well. And then lastly, the other tip I'll recommend is that if you aren't using Visual Studio Online already with your development projects, I would highly recommend looking at doing this with your teams. I mean, if you've already got MSDN Ultimate subscriptions or some of the other subscriptions, you actually do get a significant amount of this for free. It allows you to work in a team orientation in a very, very easy way. There have been some sessions, not this week, but at the SharePoint conference by Ayman Al-Hadib, who's a SharePoint MVP, where he shows that when you check in code into Visual Studio Online and obviously into TFS, it automatically builds that SharePoint app, and it can actually deploy it into your Office 365 environment for you automatically. So if you're not using source control right now, why not? But this stuff is available for you, and obviously there's different licensing models that makes it very attractive for small teams and also for large teams as well. So in summary, I hope I've helped you guys to understand why you should even be considering AngularJS. I hope I've given you a kind of an introduction, a bit of a warm-up into how to get going with AngularJS and what you need to do to get started in SharePoint. And as an example there, we have that Complete Me app where that code will be available on GitHub very shortly. And if you would like to contribute to that, we've got a nice product backlog of things we want to add to that app as we go forward. Please feel free to reach out to me. So from next steps perspective, go and have a look at the training that's available. The AngularJS conference, the ng-conf that was hosted by Google, had a significant amount of sessions on Angular. Again, I only had an hour to kind of cover Angular plus SharePoint. So if you want more on Angular, there's some great content out there in that conference. Go and dig into that Complete Me source code to see how I've wired up AngularJS. And obviously, this session's recorded, so you can kind of go through this again. And keep an eye, a hook into my RSS feed, because we are creating some more AngularJS projects as we move forward. and as we find more AngularJS developers that are interested in doing these things. So please, again, feel free to reach out to me and we'll get you kind of hooked up into the program. Now, this week, there's been a fair few SharePoint sessions and Office sessions. They are recorded. I don't know if you've noticed, but some of them have actually already been published on Channel 9. So for those of you that have missed sessions, you can go to Channel 9 and look at those build sessions. I would highly recommend, as a SharePoint primer, Brian Jones's session that was yesterday and Rob Howard's session that was a few sessions before mine as well, to give you a good idea about the new Office 365